some of it wasn't reported accurately. This is an attempt to get the facts straight. The story goes, this guy walked into a diner. Now, this was in a rundown community in northern Minnesota. There wasn't a lot happening downtown, just a couple of pawn shops and bars. But the diner was popular. There were probably 10 to 15 people there when he came through the door. It was a old-fashioned place with booths, but also with bar stools around a counter up front. The man took a seat at one of the bar stools and grabbed a menu that was just sitting there. He'd been reading it for a couple of minutes before he looked up and realized the waitress was just staring at him. At first, the guy thought it might be a racial thing. He was African American, and this being northern Minnesota, there weren't a lot of people of color in that town. He stared back at the waitress, thinking she might be the one with the problem. Then he realized the restaurant was silent. No one else in the place was making a sound. He glanced all over the room, one side to the other, and saw that everybody in the place was just staring at him. 15 or 20 white faces just looking his way, saying nothing. Every face was looking at him, except for one. About 3 bar stools down, there was a man. He was leaning over the bar in front of him, concentrating on something, ignoring everyone else. A weird clinking noise came from the bar, and it wasn't until the guy leaned over and took a good look that he realized why. This man, this weird man making all the noise, had every salt and pepper shaker in the entire restaurant. He had them all lined up right there on the bar in front of him, and he was arranging them meticulously. The guy looked around the restaurant, and sure enough, none of the tables or booths had salt and pepper, just frightened white faces. Well, it didn't take him long to see that this character with the salt and pepper fixation was not quite right. He was leaning over, working intently on this task, veins popping out of his neck, his face flush, like the most important thing in the world was arranging these salt and pepper shakers. And the vibe in the restaurant was just wrong. It felt dangerous in there. So this guy, our hero, who remember just came in for some lunch, he decided to try and lighten the mood. He'd been in enough all-white situations before to know sometimes a little joke relaxes everyone. So the guy leans over and says, "Got enough salt and pepper there?" And in the back of the room he heard an old woman gasp, and he looked back towards the sound and saw that everyone in the place was turning white as a sheet, whiter than they already were. They were terrified. And then, and only then, did he notice that the man at the counter with all the salt and pepper shakers had a gun. It was laying in his lap, a fully automatic rifle. And now the man with the gun had turned away from his salt and pepper shakers. His eyes were the size of saucers, and they were bulging out of his head. He looked high on crack, or worse, and he was just staring right at our guy. The guy didn't know what to do. He'd have to run past the man with the gun to get to the exit. There could be a back door in the kitchen, but he'd have to get over the counter to reach that. He was trapped. And then the gunman held out a single pepper shaker. He held it out to the guy, and he said, "Doesn't match." Our guy blinked. He didn't want to move or say anything that might set the gunman off. "Doesn't match," the gunman repeated. And that's when our guy looked down at the counter and saw that all the salt and pepper shakers were neatly lined up 2 by 2, 1 salt and 1 pepper together. He'd even lined them up so that all the shakers had roughly the same amount of salt or pepper in it. But there was one extra pepper shaker, the one he held out with nervous, itchy fingers. "Don't match," he said. Our guy didn't know what else to do. So he slowly, carefully, took the pepper shaker from the gunman. And when he did, the gunman said, "Find it!" The guy was so scared then he was nearly blind. I'm sorry, what? "Find salt!" And that's when he realized the gunman wanted him to find the salt shaker, the salt that went with this pepper. "Oh, okay," he said. And he got up off the bar stool, holding the pepper shaker, and began to slowly walk down the aisle. He pretended to be looking in all the booths to see if anyone had a spare salt shaker to go with this pepper. But that wasn't what the guy was really doing, of course. What he was really doing was moving closer to the door. He moved slowly, pretending to search from side to side until he got within 5 feet of the door, and then he bolted for it. He opened the door so hard the glass shattered against the building, and he took off running, never looking back. Sure he was going to hear the shots at any moment. Sure he was going to feel the hot flash and the pain on the back of his skull. But he didn't. The guy ran all the way home, 6 blocks to the apartment he had above a convenience store. And he ran inside, and he locked the door, and only then did he call 911. The police were too late. Everyone in that restaurant got shot. Most of them died, but the gunman, the salt and pepper man, got away. Weeks passed and the police had nothing to go on. They interviewed our guy a dozen times, but eventually gave up. People complained and cried and ranted about lawlessness in the city, but nothing ever came of it. Until that day, months later. That day, our guy came home and found a salt shaker. All this time, the pepper shaker the gunman had given him was sitting on a kitchen shelf in his little studio apartment. He lay awake at night, looking across the room at the shaker, illuminated by a streetlight outside the window. Some nights he could sleep with it sitting there. Some nights he couldn't. But he couldn't bring himself to move it. Not until that day. The guy walked into his apartment. He set down his keys and hit the remote for his TV. He just glanced at the spot where the pepper shaker was kept to make sure it was still there. By this time, he'd come to think that as long as he had that shaker, the crazy white man with the gun and the salt and pepper fetish could do nothing to him. But on this day, he did a double take. On this day, he saw the matching salt shaker that hadn't been there before. They both looked shiny as if someone had cleaned them just that day. And the salt was even full to the same line. The 2 shakers matched. His pepper shaker had found its mate. And the guy felt tingles run up and down his spine, and he felt a cool draft coming from the bathroom. He turned to see the bathroom door was open, and that the window inside was too, the thin curtains his mother had made him flapping in the chilly breeze. And as he turned to run for the door, he thought he heard a pop. Then he felt his head explode from the inside, and though he could still see, his legs seemed to stop working, and he tumbled to the floor. He could see his own blood oozing out from under his cheek. He reached up and touched the back of his head, and his hand came away wet. Then that hand flopped to the ground lifelessly, and he felt oblivion rushing up to meet him. And as the blackness closed in, he heard a voice from the bathroom say,